I think what I'm going to be talking about is much more local and not such a grand scale as some of the previous presenters, although I did enjoy, especially the work in China. I found that very, very entertaining. So what I'm just going to talk to you very briefly about is some work that we've been doing in Rwanda with colleagues at the Kigali Institute of Education. The colleagues are Jolly Rubagiza and Alphonse Uwabaheyo. So it's part of a project that was funded by DFID, but I was working specifically on a project with the people in Kigali Institute of Education to introduce digital technologies into schools to enhance the learning of mathematics. The approach that we used was very much to work with the schools with with the available technologies. And the sorts of things that they were trying out was using, for example, dynamic geometry or spreadsheets in order to think differently about teaching and learning mathematics. So I think we could argue that that was computer-based mathematics. But the points that I want to make, first of all, this issue of different cultures, different maths, I probably could talk a lot about that. If you just read that quote there is change. Within this research, we use learner-centered methods. For example, when I taught this lesson before, I wrote on the blackboard that addition of vectors is commutative, associative, and learners copied it in their notebooks. But in this project, we got them to work on constructions first, and then we drew some conclusions. That comes from some work with a group of 13 and 14-year-olds, and probably people would think, why are they learning those sorts of concepts in the classroom in Rwanda? Because we don't have that in our curriculum in England. So there are differences around the world, but maybe not in the same way in terms of polarizing developing and developed worlds as perhaps people who planned this session thought about. In Rwanda, it was French-speaking until quite recently, where now it is English-speaking, but it's been very heavily influenced by France and the French curriculum. Rwanda is an interesting country because the government has set an agenda, the 2020 vision, and they have a big program of supporting schools and giving schools technologies and kit in order to try to change the economy and the life for people in Rwanda. So the points that I want to make are that, to start with, the team in Kigali, they worked with quite a large group of maths teachers around the country and gave them some support through whole day workshops, and they also visited them in the classrooms to try to work with them to actually start to use these computer-based maths tools to change the teaching and learning of maths. Now, what we would have predicted and what did actually happen was that when the teachers started off, what they actually did was they used the ICT, the digital technologies, to just reinforce their normal teaching practices. I think we could have predicted that. I think that's what happens in most projects when you start using digital technologies. The technologies themselves on their own don't really make any difference whatsoever. So it might seem too simple if I say that the approach in Rwanda is very much teacher-led, but because you know that word says so many different things. But if you looked at the way a teacher might normally teach a maths classroom, which started off with a lecture and then lots of exercises and practice, that's exactly what they did when they were beginning to use these ICT tools and using projectors and so on to actually demonstrate to the children, and the students were not really getting much hands-on time. With a bit of a shift and a different way of working, Alphonse managed to work with a much smaller group of teachers in a much more intensive and time-consuming way, using a sort of school-based professional development program, so that these teachers did begin to change their practice in terms of teaching mathematics, as this quote on the screen actually talks about. So there is potential for change, but without an intensive professional development program, then it's not likely that change would happen just by giving the schools the technologies. The challenge for my colleagues in Rwanda is to think how they can scale up that particular approach. But one thing Alphonse will do, because he trains maths teachers at the Kigali Institute of Education, so one change he's going to make is to actually change his teacher education programme so that the teachers on the teacher education programme start beginning to use these digital tools or computer-based mathematics for learning maths. The second point I want to make, it's quite an important one, is that as in other countries around the world, the out-of-school use of digital technologies does influence in-school use. And some young people do have access to digital technology outside school, either in their homes or through their through their mobile phones or through internet cafes. And what my colleague Jolly Rubagiza has found through her research, both Alphonse and Jolly have been doing PhDs with us as well as being part of this DFID-funded project. But what Jolly has found is that girls are hugely disadvantaged by this out-of-school use. They're not getting access to the digital technologies out of school in the same way that the boys are. That's because they're not in general allowed to go to the internet cafes, and so they aren't getting experiences out of school, and this is having an impact on the potential for what they can do in school. So that's a big and important finding which relates particularly to that particular context of Rwanda and might be different in different countries. So the two issues that I've wanted to flag up through this presentation are, one, the importance of very intensive professional development if you want change at the level of the classroom, and two, the issue of gender inequalities that have surfaced in that Rwandan context, perhaps in a way maybe we didn't predict in quite the same way. Although we've raised issues of gender and ICT in England, some of the issues that we raised maybe 15 or 20 years ago perhaps are not so dominant as they are, as they were then, as they are nowadays. So the gender issue I thought was important to raise, particularly because at this conference it is very much populated by males, and I think it is important to raise that, particularly when you're looking at computer-based maths in developing countries.